Good morning, Year 3. It's our last story time with the borrowers this morning. I hope you enjoy it. It's a very exciting passage. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night, she did not get undressed. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it where the tick would not disturb her outside her door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled grunting a little under the duvet. She had barely closed her eyes when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its four thin legs on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush!" she said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shush!" and clasped it to her chest. She stood there in her stockinged feet at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below. A hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again. A moth-wing flutter. Candlelight. That's what it was. A moving candle. Beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery. Somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Mrs. Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound that was barely a sound could only mean one thing: the soft swing to of the green baize door, that door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downwards, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match, a glow-worm thread it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver gasped and lit the gas lights, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark, no flicker of shadow, nor sound of distant footfall. She let the door fall to again, and watched it as it swung back, slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an indrawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved towards the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish, on the floor beside the jutting board. She realised that board, that was where the light had come from. Mrs. Driver hesitated and glanced about the kitchen. Everything else looked normal and just as she had left it. The plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped cashew box, one that she knew well from the glass tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold, and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back the piece of floor. And then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and a gasping. Little people they looked like, with hands and feet, and mouths opening. That's what they looked like, but they couldn't be that, of course. Running here, there, and everywhere. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it, and it wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping and calling out for help, until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crampfurl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in!" But Mrs. Driver would not leave the table. "A nest! A nest!" she shouted. "Alive and squeaking!" Crampfurl threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered, slightly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of a nest?" Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the floor. Crampfurl walked over in his slow, deliberate way and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys they looked like, bits of rubbish. That was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot, and all the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "But I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people, like with hands, or mice dressed up."